Hey everybody, Ramey here. Hope everyone's doing well. Today what I would like to talk about is I want to talk a little bit about assessment. I just finished teaching an assessment class this summer. So I wanted to reflect a little bit on some of the things that I learned and I noticed from my students and learned from them. And some of the things I saw and issues really around assessment. So the thing I like about this course is it gives me a chance to reflect on things like reliability, validity, and all kinds of the issues that go into standardized testing, which is a huge issue in today's society. You know, we just had the cheating scandal, the big cheating scandal where a bunch of famous people, but we've had a number of other testing cheating scandals throughout history. It's not just like, you know, we think of this Hollywood cheating scandal and it's these very wealthy people, but that's not always the case. Sometimes it was the poorest districts or middle-class districts or whoever cheating on these exams. And the question is, why are we cheating? Why do we have the exams? Are the exams good? What purpose do they serve? What's the history behind them? I mean, there's all kinds of really good questions. And when you start to think about it, it becomes really, really mind-boggling when you try to make sense of it and say, well, this is what it should be, because you start looking at this from all angles and you're like, whoa, there's really good points on all different sides of this, of assessment in general. So let's talk a little bit about standardized testing in general. So, you know, and the big thing we use standardized testing for is in K-12 schools, right? We compare students on grade levels, and then we have like admission requirements. This is in America, of course. Other countries have their own variations, and it's much different in other countries as well. But in the United States, you know, with the SAT or the ACT, the big test that students are used to get into college. Now, the question is, first of all, are these tests fair? And that's a really interesting question. Because on one level, hey, here's what a kid in third grade or taking the SAT is supposed to know, right? A kid in whatever grade or essay, let's just use the kid taking the SAT, all kids taking the SAT should know all of this knowledge or have been taught all this knowledge. So we have this equal scoring system across all kids in the United States. And on some level, that's a good thing that we have that, because we can compare and make some sense of those numbers. But on the other hand, is it fair to the student that went to a school and wasn't taught some of the information? Or, I mean, what if a kid was pulled out for whatever reason? They were sick or they happened to miss certain things and their score's lower, not because they're not smart enough to do well, because they haven't been taught it. So you have all kinds of issues like that. And then we say, well, we can blame the school or the parents, and that's fine. But there are issues with that as well, because if we start making a test worth that much, what's the end result? Schools figure out these are the objectives of the test. This is what we're going to spend all of our time teaching to, so that our students do really well on this test, so that we look really good as teachers, so we actually get a raise, so our kids actually go to good colleges, our parents are all happy, our administrators are all happy. Everyone is just hunky-dory. So there's a big problem with that. So you see all these different issues here. Then the issue is, okay, well then we're holding two standardized tests, there's too much weight. So what do we do? Let's not care about the test. Okay, well then how are we comparing these kids? How do you compare a kid in New York versus a kid in Virginia? Can you look at their grades? I mean, they're both at different schools. So what if one school, the teachers all grade really easily, and the other school, the teachers grade really hard? How is that reflected in that application then? Without the test score at least has some base level. So you can see all these different issues that come up when you start to think about, well, how are these standardized tests used? Are they used correctly? That's a validity issue. So we're talking about a validity issue. We're talking about, like, does the test measure what it's supposed to measure? And are we using the test correctly? Reliability is the chance that if the kid consistently takes the test, they're going to score about the same. So like, they're not going to get like 1,000 one day and like a 1,600 the next day, you know, because then the test is not, there's no reliability. Without reliability, we can't have any kind of validity. So, you know, looking at tests like that, what is the SAT really good at? One thing that the SAT has a really strong correlation with is first year GPA. So we know that the first year GPA in college, SAT is a really good predictor. And, I went back and, with my classes, and we looked at SAT scores from like the 70s, 80s, 90s, 2000s up to like 2016 when they started to change some of the scoring. So it's not really correlated as well anymore. You can't really just compare the scores. But when you look at the scores, they haven't really went up or down. I mean, there are years where like it's down one year, the average, but then the next year kind of starts to come back, and it varies. There's quite a bit of it's very consistent across years. I mean, I can pull some data and make it look like it's going down, but there are some factors for that. So I don't necessarily, the scores are very comparable about what's been happening. You look at the averages and they really haven't changed too much except by points. There's not been like a 200-point jump in one direction or the other, is what I'm trying to get at. There's been some small variations, but nothing that's huge. So, you start to think about these tests and how they're used and things that are coming up, like cheating scandal. Why does it exist? Because we hold so much weight to the test. Should we be holding so much weight? It's a really good question. I don't claim to have an answer for it. And I don't want to have an answer. I don't want to tell you what you should be thinking about it. I just think it's an issue that we should be considering. Admission or any kind of criteria that we're admitting for jobs. The main thing that I stress when I'm talking to my students about these issues of validity, when we're talking about these tests, especially like these high stakes tests, is that whenever you're hiring for something, admitting for something, make sure you're actually testing and your criteria are for the actual job. Now, what does that sound like? Sounds like an instructional designer, right? That is exactly what we preach as curriculum designers, right? I shouldn't be teaching something that's not an objective of mine, right? And then I shouldn't be testing something that I haven't taught to the students. Same thing goes with these high stake tests. As long as they're really measuring what they're supposed to be measuring, then we shouldn't have too many issues, except when we start to get into students that weren't taught it or whatever. And then we have a problem of the teachers continuously keep teaching this stuff. So all kinds of issues around that. So that's like the high stakes assessment part of what I wanted to talk about. So, I find all that really interesting. I get validity aspect of testing. I think it's really interesting because, first of all, we throw around the terms validity and reliability like nothing. We just throw them around. Like, I don't think we really even know what they are. And I think, so let me give an example. So one of the things I present to my students is I present to them a scale, like to weigh yourself, and I step on the scale and it says I weigh 140 pounds. Now so my real weight is around 170. So I step on the scale, it says I weigh 140 pounds. I step on the scale the next day, 140 pounds. I step on the scale the next day, 140 pounds. I go to the doctor's office, certified real scale says I weigh 170. So is my scale reliable or valid? Neither or both. What is it? So my scale that's saying I weigh 140 pounds is very reliable. It's every day I step on it, it says I weigh 140 pounds, but it's reliably bad because it's not correct. It's just reliable. It's reliably bad. So that's very possible. So we can say something's reliable, but that doesn't mean it's good. And a lot of times we have to know what we're talking about when we say that term. So it can be reliably bad. Now it can't be valid for anything because we know it's not correct. I couldn't use that to say this is what my weight is. So the validity is how are we using it? How are we interpreting that score? I can't interpret that score to say 30 pounds because I didn't. It would be incorrect. So there's no validity there, but it's reliable. It's just not reliable at all. Now, if I were stepping on the scale, one day it said I weighed 140, one day it said I weighed 160, one day it said I weighed 110, one day it said I weighed 220. Now the scale's unreliable. It's just not reliable. So that's a really simple way to think about reliability. And validity is simply, are we using this correctly? How are we using it? So like, for example, when we look at these big high stakes tests like the SAT, if they tell me this is how you should use the test, this is how you should use the test. So let me use an example. Let me take an example. Let me take a spoon. No, let me take a pen, actually. Let me take a pen. And let's say the company that makes this pen says this pen is used for writing, and you should be using it for writing, and it's really good at writing. And this pen is great, has a really strong correlation with great ink flow and writing well on paper. And I take this pen and I say, you know what? This should make a really good baseball. And I take it, me and my buddies, and we take it to the baseball field, and I try to pitch it and hit with it, and it's really bad. And I come back and I say, this pen is terrible. So the problem there is that I'm trying to use something for, and that's a really, really extreme, like off the wall example, but I'm just trying to make a point that I'm trying to take something that's not meant for baseball and make it into that, and then judge it based on that, and maybe make decisions like say to someone, well, you're not a good baseball player because you couldn't hit this pen, or you couldn't throw this pen 90 miles an hour. You could never make the pros. So that's a lot of times what happens with some of these high stakes tests. We give a test and we're using it for something that it's not supposed to be used for. So we have to be very, very careful when we're looking at any kind of criteria, so real life example. So this was way off the wall example, real life example. So fireman's test. What was happening is we were dismissing people from the fireman's academy because maybe I think the rule, this was a real case, but I'm kind of making up these numbers. So, because I can't recall the exact numbers, but you had to be able to carry a person down a ladder that was 150 pounds. It was something like that. And what was happening is if you failed that part of the test, you couldn't be a fireman. So what was happening is someone sued and said, well, wait a second, I'm training. My goal in the fire academy is going to be the driver of the fire truck, or the person who holds the hose, or because they have different jobs. At least at that academy, the way they divided up. Some firehouse, you do everything, but this one did not. So they said, well, that's not what I'm going to be doing for my job. Why should I be doing that during the test? And so obviously they won because it's the same thing as the baseball example. You can't have a criteria that's not being used. It goes back to instructional design when I talk about instructional congruency. The objectives must be the same as the content taught, must be what you assess. Can't go outside that box. So I hope that makes sense. That's just my little reliability and validity discussion. And it's a subject that really fascinates me. I'm really interested by it just because we use the terms all the time, and I really like explaining to people what they mean. I also like looking at different tests and thinking like, are we using this correctly? So here's what we have at my university, which is kind of interesting because we have a huge validity and reliability issue. Well, validity issue at my university. So we have this. So the way we rate faculty, whether you're a good teacher or not, is based on student evaluation score. Now, I'm not going to talk about whether student evaluation scores are good or bad. That's not what I'm talking about here. But what I want to talk about is the test. So they give students at the end of the semester an assessment to fill out, like, is the instructor good? They give them like a 20-question test, like yes, no, did they cover their topics, that kind of stuff. Okay, so here's the issue with the assessment. So the company that makes the assessment says in order to have valid scores, you must meet a few criteria. So like you should have a minimum of 60% of students in the class have completed the assessment. So minimum of 60% students. So if you have a class of 20 students, you should have 12 have taken it, right? Okay. So the next thing it says is that there should be a minimum of 10 students who have filled it out. So if you only have a class of 10 students and only 9 of them completed it, you wouldn't meet that criteria, right? So we have this criteria like that. And then what happens, what's really interesting, is if I teach a class of 30 students and only 3 students complete the test, my scores are counting for me at my university. So is that a reliability or validity issue? It's a validity issue, and we're purposely rating faculty based on a score that should be dismissed, that the company itself says, do not use this. It's like the Penn baseball example. It's really, really interesting. So think about in your life and things you're doing. Start to look for those kind of issues because they're really, really important. If something is not valid, why is it being used and how is it being used? Now, in the case of my university, they could be facing problems if someone were to fight this, because we do have the data really showing what they're doing. But, you know, unless it affects someone personally, they're probably not going to do it. And I don't know how much those scores matter. That's a whole nother issue. But, you know, high stakes tests like that should be used 100% correctly. So it's just something to think about. You know, I really like those kind of issues, but that's about all I wanted to talk about today. Just kind of, you know, update everyone on what I was doing. I am going away. I'm done teaching for the summer, finally, kind of excited about that. So I'm taking a little break. I'm taking a few weeks to kind of go on vacation with some family and do some fun stuff, which is always very exciting. And yeah, that's about it. It's about all that's going on for me. So thank you guys. Have a good day. Bye.